generosity. We are in our last week of this series. Over the last 4 weeks, we've been thinking about what it looks like to have a spiritual practice of generosity. Now, I wonder this morning, how many of you have ever saved up for something? Anybody ever set aside money? Lots of us have, haven't we? You've said, some of you, Jeff, you've not raised your hand. I'm sure you have done. But we all have, haven't we? We've set aside money. Maybe we're investing because we want to go on a holiday. Maybe you have a fund set aside. I don't know. I save up to get my hair done because it's expensive. Or maybe you set aside money for your kids. Maybe there's a fund, to help them with uni or to help them, get started. We know what it is to invest in something, right? We invest our money in the kind of future that we want. If I want a future that has, Greece in it, I'm going to have to do something with my money now. I'm going to have to set it aside in a way so that I'm preparing for the future that I plan to have. We understand this, don't we? So the question that I want us to think about this morning, and we'll keep coming back to it, but I'm just going to plant it early with you, is what kind of future are you planning for? If you looked at your finances, if you went home and you opened up, if you have a spreadsheet or whatever, you open up your bank balance, what kind of future would it tell you that you were planning for? I want to remind us that the reason that we're talking about generosity is not, it's a nice tick list because I want to be a nice person or a good citizen. I've been meeting with someone who's not yet a Christian, and we were talking, and I said, we're talking about who Jesus is and why would someone follow Jesus, and it's been very interesting. And one of the things this person said to me is, well, I want to be a good person. And I thought, well, that's not enough, is it? We know it's hard to follow Jesus, and if that's all we've got, it won't be enough, is it? So we've continued to have these kind of conversations. I don't want you to be generous just so you be a nice person. There's a lot of ways to be a nice person that don't require the kind of generosity that we've been talking about, that Jesus. We are talking about practicing the way of Jesus, moving through the world, the way that Jesus moved through the world. We want to become like Jesus. Now, I'm going to tie it back to running because it's what I do, right? That I want to run a marathon. And for a while, you might have believed me because I ran a half marathon and I was doing a training program and I did all sorts of things. These days, you might have your doubts. But a person who wants to, can you imagine if you came to someone and said, oh, I want to run a marathon? You said, oh, that's amazing. Have you started your training? No, I need to find the right program. I haven't started training yet. Oh, that's right. So what kind of running are you doing? Oh, no, I'm not running yet. I'm just, that's what I'm planning to do. Oh, okay. What are your favorite shoes? You like your best running shoes? No, I'm going to go buy some running shoes next week. Do you really believe that's a person who's invested in running a marathon? They've not even got their shoes yet. It's the first step. So when we talk about this idea of, I want to become like Jesus, I can just start, let's just dive right into the deep end. I wonder if sometimes we say, I want to become like Jesus, but when we think about the steps that we need to take in order to live a life that's like him, we say, oh, I'm intending to be generous like Jesus. No, I think fasting is great and I want to get to that. No, Sabbath is so important. I wonder how often these steps, because that's what these spiritual practices are. They're steps in a journey. They're an investment in the kind of future that I want. I want to become more like Jesus. It's not going to happen by accident. It's going to take efforts, intentionality. And so talking about, I'm just wanting to ground us back in so that this doesn't just sound like a sermon series on how to be a nice person, tick a box. Right? That this is about, the only reason it matters to be generous is so that I can become like Jesus. It is a step and a process. It's part of the training program, if you will. If I want to be a person who runs a marathon, I'm going to have to run 3 or 4 times a week. I'm probably going to need a good set of shoes and hopefully not get injured. That's what I'm going to need to do. What are we going to need to do in order to become like Jesus? And the Bible tries to unpack that for us. So we're going to look this morning at Luke chapter 12. If you have your Bibles, or it might be on the screen for us, Jen, it's Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 34. If you want to look that up in your Bible. In the Beacon Bible, it's page 1045, or 44, sorry. 1044, Luke chapter 12. And it's a longish passage, but I'm just going to read the whole thing for us, beginning in verse 13. Jesus is speaking here, and he's addressing a crowd of people. Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13, this is what it says. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What should I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you've got plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who's going to get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wild flowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. And your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So let's try to unpack this just briefly. This passage begins, we started with this interaction, a little bit of an unusual interaction. There's two brothers who come to Jesus. And maybe it seems strange. Why would they come to Jesus about an inheritance debate, basically? Two siblings fighting over their parents' will and who gets the inheritance. A part of that will be rooted in the fact that the religious leaders of Jesus' time, they were both religious leaders, and they held a sort of civic responsibility. It's not like today, where the pastor's just the pastor and, stay in your lane, Chrissy. Jesus, the religious leaders of that time, they dealt with religious disputes, but also civic disputes, right? And so people would come to the priest or the teachers of the law, those who studied, because remember, they were a theocracy. So they saw themselves as primarily living under God's law. What does God say for how we should live? And so they come to the religious leaders and say, we have a debate. And the religious leader would then say, well, this is, do this or that, right? So this is why, maybe it's a younger son, we don't know exactly who, but maybe it's a younger son coming and asking this question. And Jesus is very clearly not interested. He says, I'm not interested in solving this dispute between you. But he uses it as an opportunity because he sees their hearts, doesn't he? He sees that the thing they're worried about is how much am I going to get for me? And he's unhappy with what he sees. And so he then goes in and he tells us this story. It's a short parable. It's fairly straightforward. Maybe familiar. There's a man, he's well off, he's wealthy, he's done well, he's planted his fields, and he's got a surplus of grain. And he doesn't have enough room to store all of the abundance that he has. And so he decides the best way to handle this surplus, that God has blessed him with an abundance. He's been so successful in his farming business that he decides, I'm going to build an even bigger barn. I'm going to put everything in there. And now finally, as I look at what I'm going to need for the rest of my life, I look at what I've got and realize I can sit back now. I can just rest on what I have, and I can retire, and I can live the good life. Now, this is not an indictment on retirement. I hope to retire one day too, so you can all just rest at ease. But I want you to hear what's being said here. So we'll have a harder time seeing this. So I want to just help to unpick why this is so, Jesus is making such a strong statement. Because this was an agrarian economy. So it's a little bit, wealth in that economy is a little bit of a zero-sum game. You are wealthy as defined by how many sheep you have or how much grain you have. Well, there's a limited supply. They weren't cloning, what was the dolly, they weren't cloning them back then. You couldn't just print more money like we do, right? And now everybody's rich, right? It doesn't work that way. So if this guy has 2 sheep and this guy has 10 sheep, well, in order for this guy to have more sheep, somebody else has to have less sheep. Do you see this, right? So what Jesus is then pointing out is this person has all this grain. I wondered why Jesus didn't say, how's he going to keep it from going bad for the rest of his life? But that's not the point, is it? But he has all this grain. And Jesus says, in order for you to be that wealthy, the people around you have to have less. That's the way. Do you see this? That doesn't work quite the same way for us. But this is the heart that Jesus is coming to. That Jesus is saying, here's a person who's looking at the need around him. He's looking at, the way I imagine, I was sitting in my study last night and yesterday afternoon, I was thinking about this and thought, I just imagined, what if I had a homeless person in my back garden and I had 10 loaves of bread and this person had nowhere to live and was in my back garden and hadn't eaten for a week, but I had 10 loaves of bread and I calculated, this will get me through the next 2 weeks. Great. What would you'd be like, Christy, that's brutal. That's exactly what's happening here. It's like you had a homeless person in your back garden and you have more food than you could eat even in the next week. And Jesus is saying, how could you possibly think it would be acceptable to keep that when your brother or your sister is starving right beside you? Right? This is the story Jesus is telling. I do think it's interesting that what amounts to the villain in Jesus' story is often the hero in our culture. The person who can make a lot of wealth and retire and never have to think about it again. There's something about that. But Jesus makes a comment in verse 21 as he comes down to the end of this parable. He's talking about an investment. He says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. That phrase, rich towards God. He's talking about an investment. He says, this guy is foolish, because he's invested all of his energy into a future that doesn't exist, that no day is promised, that he has worked for everything he has and he's invested in a future that doesn't exist, and the future that lasts for eternity, the future where we're with God. He's not made any effort to invest in the one that's going to last forever, and the one that lasts for 60, 70, 80, maybe 100 if we're Mary Campbell, And maybe that future, but that might be all we get. Just a few decades. And then we have eternity. And Jesus says, how foolish can you be? Anybody knows. Don't invest in the short term. Think long term. And long term is really long term. And so Jesus is questioning, what kind of future is this person thinking about? And then he goes into, did you notice in verse 22 that word therefore? It should always, every time I read it, my pastor as a kid growing up, always he said, so I shall share it with you so you can now, every time you see it. He's always said, when you see the word therefore, you should ask yourself, what's it there for? So that's what runs through my head. But it means it's referring back to what just was said. So Jesus says, because of this parable where I've told you that this guy is a villain because he had all this stuff and he kept it for himself when someone else was starving. And he knows what they're thinking. Yes, but Jesus, I can so relate to this moment. Because what they're thinking is probably what I'm thinking. Yes, but Jesus, if I give away what I've worked hard for, what will I have when I'm 90? And I ask myself this question because I have made some questionable choices for ministry's sake. And some of you will have made some, what others will say are questionable choices for the sake of generosity. And you say, yes, but what happens? I can't work till I die, Jesus. And he says, therefore, Don't worry about your life. And it's very familiar, isn't it? See, Jesus says, he reminds us, perhaps out of this goodness and this graciousness, that often our lack of generosity is not rooted in greed, it's rooted in fear. It's rooted in, not that I don't want to help others, I'm afraid I won't have enough for myself or my family. And Jesus says, I see that, I know that, I understand that. Of course I love you. Of course I'm going to provide for you. Remember, it goes back to week 1, if you were here. Abundance mentality versus scarcity mentality. Do I believe in a God who has enough to provide? Do I believe that there is enough in the world for everyone who lives in it, and God can provide for my needs? Do I believe that? It's where the rubber meets the road. As a church, we've been there, haven't we? We've had to make faith-based decisions, haven't we? And said, we believe that the money is going to come. It's a lot harder when we're thinking about our own future sometimes to say, am I going to make a choice for generosity that means I've got to live for faith in a future that I'm not sure exactly? Do you see this? Jesus is wanting us to think about, and he's not without compassion. I love in verse 32, he says, don't be afraid, little flock. There's something quite tender about that, isn't there? He's not angry. It's important, I think, that we get the tone of the words. He's not angry with us. He's not like, oh, you greedy, horrible people who want to retire, how dare you? That's not the tone. He's compassionate. He says, I understand the worry and the fear of the kind of generosity that he's talking about. The kind of generosity we said last week that might be marked not by what should I give, but what should I keep because it doesn't belong to me. That is radical. That is unheard of generosity. That is scary generosity. And yet, Jesus wants us to recenter. And so he ends this passage, verse 33 and 34. He ends it sort of refocusing. He's given his teaching, he's given the story, and he brings it right back down and says, look, this is the point. He cares about where we invest for the future. Sell your possessions, give to the poor. And look, he says, provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out. He says, invest in the long-term future, not the short-term. He cares about what kind of future we're investing in. And ultimately, he wants our hearts. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He wants our hearts. So what I want to do is I want to bring in on these two things. Jesus says this is why he's talking about this. This is what matters. And so this is where I want to linger for just a couple of minutes. I'm aware, just a couple of minutes. First, Jesus says he wants our hearts. He's talking here about loyalty and love. He's talking about the fact that he wants our hearts more than our hearts belong to our money, our possessions, our ambitions, our families. That Jesus is the thing that has our loyalty more than anything else. Our dreams, our hopes, our plans. Jesus says he wants it first. Practicing this kind of way of following Jesus is countercultural. Tim Keller, who's a pastor from America, the Americans are taking over today. Tim Keller is a pastor from America. He's done a lot of writing, and he coined a phrase. I've never heard this before, and I thought this was very interesting. He coined the phrase financial promiscuity for the way that Jesus wants us to be generous. This is what he writes. It's just a quote from Tim Keller. He says, the early church was strikingly different from the culture around it in this way. The pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically gave everybody their body. And the Christians came along and they gave practically nobody their body and they gave practically everybody their money. And it was shocking. That's what Tim Keller calls financial promiscuity. You see, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. And in Acts chapter 2, verse 45, we have a picture of this early church that Tim Keller describes. And it says that they sold their possessions and they gave to those who had need. It's like they knew this is what Jesus said. So what does it look like for a church to come together? And they redefined the idea of poor to anyone who had need. And I just want to point out, because you know what I'm like, it's not the point of the sermon, but if you kept reading 2 more verses, Acts chapter 2, verse 47, it says that the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. I just want to be clear, generosity is missional. There's something profoundly countercultural about people who prioritize others to the extent of a generosity that says, I will give away what I have, I will invest in a future that I can't see. There's something about that kind of community that makes people say, a bit like, why do you have supper every week? Why are you doing this? Why are you planting a church in Nepal? Why are you having children that you don't know and you're creating a home for this? And the people around say, why would you choose to live that way? There's something profoundly missional about living the way of Jesus, even when we're just doing it within the church. People walk in the door and say, what is this? I've never seen a community like this. I've never sat around a dinner table where people care who I am in this way. I've never been a part of people who say, you need something, I've got something you need. That's what happens at BFG. I'm doing some research and I spent some time, and I said to Judy, what's all the stuff everybody's got? And she said, well, some people have fruits and vegetables like Sue. Some people have puzzles. Some people have books. Someone else had a bag of I don't know what. She said, yeah, people have things at home they don't need, and they bring it along for somebody who might need it. This kind of generosity is missional. It's not the point of the sermon, but I can't help it. The second point, last one, is Jesus says he wants us to invest in the kind of future that we want to have. Invest in the kind of future you want. If you want a future where you become like Jesus and you're planning to stand before Jesus and to live with him in paradise, then you want to invest in a future that's preparing for that. So I was in London this week and I got to meet all sorts of interesting people on this course that I'm taking, because it's Anglicans and Baptists. I met some bishops. Things are kind of important. I didn't quite know what to say. I'm sure I was trying to represent the Baptists as best I could, But in this one conversation with a few folk, this bishop, he's the Bishop of Islington, and he says that he's met a couple of American businessmen. I'm sorry that they're all Americans. It's not on purpose. It was the Bishop of Islington who told me the story. And he said he met this American businessman who had a successful business and he just sold it. And another, I don't know if it was his partner or just another guy, another friend, said he wanted to go in on this. And they had this heart that God had put on their hearts, that they want to use their money to plant churches in Western countries where Christianity is struggling, places like the UK. That's the vision that God's given them. And so he said by sometime next year, this two guys who sold these businesses are going to have $150 million to invest in church planting in the West. And their intention is to invest $1 billion in planting a church. Now you could say, look, he could give away $10 million and keep the rest and he'd still be generous, wouldn't he? He would be. It would be generous. What could you do in this country with $10 million to plant churches? A lot. And we would say that's generous. We're talking about a different kind of generosity. A kind that says, I have enough for me. Now we don't have $1 billion, but can you just imagine if he kept, let's say he gave 10 million, but he kept 909, I don't know how much, 990 million? I'm a pastor, not a mathematician, but that's a good thing. Can you imagine, he would have lived a good life, he could pass it down to his kids as he create generational wealth. Isn't that good? I mean, well, I'm not saying anything about that. But what I am saying is, can you imagine? You know, all I could think about is, what is it going to be like when these two guys stand before Jesus and he says, what did you do with what I gave you? And he doesn't need to say a word, because he'll be surrounded not by 10 or 20, but literally thousands of people who say, I became a Christian in a church in Stafford because you gave money and we planted it. And I became a Christian in Germany, and I became a Christian in France, and I became a Christian in Australia because you gave your money. And Jesus says, well done, good and faithful servants. They're investing in the future that they intend to have, and it's not short-sighted. I know some closer to home stories. I know about someone who is supporting children to go to school in their hometown. not through any organization, they just know they need some support, and so they said, well, I could help get what they need to make sure they get off to school. I know there were dozens of people in our church who support the work that's happening in Nepal, in Kathmandu, in Gimdi, at the Smile Home, that we give, don't we, £12 a month to make sure that there's a child in Gimdi who can go to school. I know that there are people who are supporting the work in Uganda, aren't they? Giving donations, making trips, investing in the lives of children who need it. I know there are folk in our congregation who've given home to refugees from Ukraine, who needed a space to live, who needed somewhere safe when home wasn't safe. But maybe these things still feel too big for some of us. They are big. They do feel like huge things. I don't have millions, Chrissy. We can do something. Maybe God stirs us because we need to just give to our church. I've said over and over again, this is not a sermon series where I'm begging you to give to the church. But if that's what God's saying to you, then respond. Or maybe you say, you know what, Ruth hosts a community space every Thursday and they have a hot meal. And maybe I could go to Ruth and say, I'll cook one of those meals a month. I'll bring a meal. Because that's the kind of generosity that I'm capable of. I know the 9:30, I don't know if it's advertised yet, but I know the 9:30 is going to do a quiz on you for Tier Fund at the end of November. Probably a couple of quid, I don't know how much money it is, but it's a small thing. But maybe it's an act to say we're choosing to be generous. Or maybe like Acts chapter 2, verse 45, they sold their possessions. They didn't give them to the poor, it said they gave to those who had need. That maybe it's an act of looking around you in your church, on your street, at your kid's school, and saying, who has a need? And could I meet that need? I have people meet my needs all the time in ways that I find surprising. You know what need I have? I won't say where or how, because the person wouldn't want me to. But I came home from 3 days in London, and you know what need was meant for me? Because I'm a procrastinator, and I don't know what's wrong with me, really. I found some batteries that were left for me, because I have a smoke detector that needs batteries. And someone said, Chrissy, you've not put batteries in for like how many weeks? Here's some batteries. It sounds silly, doesn't it? But you know, I felt loved. I'm not saying go around giving each other batteries, but I'm trying to make it as big as it could be or as small as it needs to be. Yeah? That generosity is about an attitude of your heart that says, if you have a need and I can meet it, I'm not worried about myself because I want to invest in a future that is bigger than me. We need to finish. My question for you as we finish is, what kind of future are you investing in? And I'm not asking you that rhetorically. I'm going to give you a challenge. I'll never know if you do it, so it's without any scariness. But if you take it seriously, my challenge for you is to sit down with your budget, well, your bank account, or however you do your finances, with your partner or family, however you do that, and look at it. And, here's the list of things that are necessities. Be a bit ruthless with yourself about what's a necessity, and set those aside. Those are necessities. And then here's everything else. And my suggestion for you is, one, if there is no everything else, because the necessities take every bit, if there's a way, and I understand there's not always, if there's a way, can you create margin so that you can be generous? And if there is margin, and you have, these are the extra things that we get to do because God has blessed us. I'm not asking you not to do those things, but I'm asking you, on balance, when you look at the sheet, if you were someone, this was someone else's finances, what future would you say they were investing in based on what you do with that money? That's between you and God. I won't know if you do it or not. I'm not going to ask you. But if you take it seriously, if you sat down and looked at the money that you spend, does it look like that it's where your heart is going? This is who I am as a person, and it's reflected in my finances. You'll decide. You and the Holy Spirit and your family, you'll decide. I'm not suggesting what that should or shouldn't be, because it's not for me, and it'll be different for all of us. But what is the Holy Spirit saying about investing in a future that allows us to become like Jesus? that allows us to care about the needs of the people around us, and allows us to live with a mentality of abundance that says, I trust in a God who provides. Do something. Do anything. It's the worst challenge. It's the same as last week, but I can't give you but I am imploring you. I want you as your pastor to be more like Jesus. I want to be more like Jesus. And so I am imploring you, do something. Choose generosity, because I want us to be the kind of community that the Lord adds to our number daily. Those who are being saved, because the generosity of the people in the room is just incomprehensible. Speak to us, that we would hear your Holy Spirit, that folk in the room would not hear my voice, that they wouldn't hear what my opinions are or what I think, but that they would be enabled to hear your Spirit, encouraging them. God, I pray for those who need to hear it, that they would hear a well done. God, I pray for those who are struggling, that they would hear a don't be afraid, little flock. And God, for those who have been blessed, I pray that you would open up for them the joy and the excitement that is available to them, that they could give generously and be a blessing to others. And I pray that they would be filled with excitement over the possibilities. Help us to have a desire in us that longs to know you and to be like you, Jesus. We ask that in your precious name.